Så er det igen blevet tid til at byde velkommen til Papstinenser, din podcast om brætspil. Din studievært er Christian Bak-Petersen. Welcome to Papstinenser. Mit navn er Bo Jørgensen. Jeg skal nok lade være med at spille dum. Velkommen til Papstinenser, mine damer og herrer. Det er Danmarks største podcast om brætspil og moderne kortspil. I dag der kommer episoden rent faktisk til at foregå på engelsk, fordi da vi var på Fastaval i påskeferien i 2017, der interviewede vi Jason Mathews, som er designeren bag Twilight Struggle. Så dagens episode er min snak med ham, hvor han kommer fra, hvordan Twilight Struggle er opstået, og hvordan hele modtagelsen af det har været. Twilight Struggle har i perioder ligget nummer 1 på Board Game Geek. Hvis jeg husker ret, ligger den stadigvæk i top 5, og er et koldkrigs to-personers spil. Og i dag skal vi høre, hvordan Jason Mathews har oplevet hele den succes, og hvad han ellers svarede på af gode spørgsmål. Vi håber, I kan lide det. So just, I think we're all a bit rusty. It's Sunday morning here in Fastaval 2017. And we're sitting here with Jason Mathews from Washington, one of the designers behind the much acclaimed Twilight Struggle. And Jason, we initially would like to hear from you. Sort of how was your stay here in Denmark? Did you arrive well? And could you share a few thoughts with us of your experience of the festival so far?
Thank you so much. Well, I was fortunate enough to be able to bring my children as well. It's their spring break in the United States, so we all traveled to Fastaval together. And, as you probably know, Denmark, maybe for the first time in American history, featured prominently in American elections the last cycle.
Yes.
So it was interesting to see how this country is actually organized, because the politicians in Washington were talking quite a bit about it.
Yeah.
But it relates to how Fastaval is organized, because, the main observation that almost any American would have about this convention is that it is not commercial in the way that our conventions almost always are.
Yeah.
Admittedly, we have small conventions, little community conventions as well, but this is sort of a gathering of people from all over Denmark, and any place where you might make money, you don't. You decline.
Yeah.
And it
With
wouldn't
pride.
with pride.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be that way in the United States.
No.
For better or worse.
And is that obvious to you the minute you step in, that why aren't they exploiting this opportunity, or how would you say it?
Yes, we definitely still maximize in the United States for everything, pretty much. I don't want to give you the sense that there's no communitarian spirit.
Sure.
Most of our conventions are also run by volunteers, etc. But for our major conventions, for sure, or for places where we're running tournaments or food at conventions or any of those things, they would be commercial undertakings where people were trying to make money.
Okay. I think, you mentioned to me when we briefly spoke yesterday that you could see that this festival experience was going a bit more to the artsy side, or I don't know if that was the word we actually used, but that there was definitely a more tend towards designing for the user's experience, at least. Admittedly, even though the games that would come out of it wouldn't really have a chance to fly in the commercial world. How do you see that as like a person coming from the outside and seeing this design competition?
I think it's definitely true that Europeans in general and Denmark in particular is a little ahead of U.S. thinking about whether games should be art and whether they should be explored in that way. it is a little bit of a dark side to the reality that games are making money for the first time, right? So now that they're making money, who's got time for playing around with thought experiments? Let's go make money. And again, at our conventions, there's a little more of an orientation towards publishers and retailers. So at a convention this size, this convention has basically two retailers, one for miniatures and role-playing equipment, and one for the board gamers, which also has some role-playing stuff. At a convention this size in the United States, there'd probably be 5, so there would be more of that. And there would be more publishers who are trying to push out their material into the public. Here, the orientation is towards local designers trying to introduce their material to a broader public. And it tends to be more experimental, and it tends to be more thoughtful and a little less conventional.
Yeah. And I guess that's seen as a good thing here.
Yeah.
It is.
I think it's a good thing, period, right?
Yeah.
But, so the next great design will have to come from somewhere like this, where they're playing around at the edges.
Yeah, I think what we have experienced is that the role-playing community has lent a lot to each other. The different writers have looked at each other and been inspired by each other, and we're sort of seeing the same thing happening in the board game design tradition, that people are pushing, as you were saying, towards the limits or the outer reaches of what we're normally seeing. So I think playable first, and then perhaps commercially interesting in as a secondary thing. Jason, we might as well get into talking about your board gaming career. Could you just and I believe you've probably said this 1,000 times, but could you just give our listeners a quick introduction to you and your ludography?
Well, so I started as a gamer about when I was 11 or 12. My dad knew I was a history nerd, and so he brought home a copy of Axis and Allies for Christmas, and he and I played every weekend for years almost, and 2 or 3 times a weekend. It became a mania. Okay. And then I went looking for more. That was great. What's the next thing? And one of our 2 major conventions in the U.S. is Origins, and it was the board gaming oriented convention in the U.S. at the time. It had started traveling, and it showed up in Los Angeles, and I went there, and I walked into this room. They were recreating the Battle of Wagram. I don't know if it was 1-to-1 miniatures, but it filled a room like this, and I was in heaven. And I was like, "Oh, this is the greatest thing ever."
What age were you at that time?
I was probably 14, I think. Okay. I was like a freshman. Yeah,
mind-blowing.
It was. I had never seen anything like it. I was like, "This is the greatest thing that ever happened." So I convinced my mother to buy me a bunch of lead, and I started going blind, painting little 15mm Napoleonic soldiers, and I got into that part of the hobby. Then I found the rest of wargaming, sort of the hex encounter stuff that you're familiar with.
Before you get ahead of yourself, you were a history nerd before you turned 14.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about that.
Well, so unlike most Americans, my family hasn't been in the United States that long. My grandfather is Welsh, and he emigrated to the United States when his parents died, and a few of his brothers and sisters were already in the U.S. So he became a citizen in World War II, and he was the person I looked up most to in life. So because of that link, I was always interested in British history and the rest of it. I didn't know at the time that the Welsh really hate the British, but it's a different something I discovered later. So, and when I was little, he was fascinated by the American West. So he had all of these, what we call time life books. They're histories, but they have a lot of pictures in them. So he would read them to me on his lap, and that's how I grew to love history.
And later on, then you sort of maximized your history lessons into board gaming. You mentioned Axis and Allies, which I believe is a 5-player game. At best, yeah.
I guess we'd have the Italians or something, but anyway. Yes.
Yeah. But what other games were around that you remember from your youth, if not your direct childhood?
So I guess that's the other thing. I always liked board gaming anyway. So I played a lot of Stratego, which I found endlessly fascinating because it had little soldier depictions on it as well. And I remember the summer someone introduced me to Risk. I was probably 9 or something, and I thought I could never find enough people to play with, so I would sadly have to play solo sometimes on another poor sad nerd. But then all kinds of games. My family played a lot of cards as well, so that kind of thing.
Okay. And then fast forward to you getting into designing games. Was that initially trying to fix weird things with the games you already had? Well, we've heard that from several other designers that they had the components from Axis and Allies, and now they try to make it the battle of the local boroughs or whatever they tried to sort of reuse the components for. When would you say that you actively became a board game designer? Is that a fixed point in time?
It is kind of a fixed point in time, but I am not that guy. I think also because I'm a lawyer, my brain is more like, well, these are the rules, so that's the law, and I need to understand what the designer intends, but I'm not really interested in fiddling with his work. So I didn't come at it that way at all. I never experimented with somebody else's game. In fact, anybody who proposed a house rule, I was against, basically.
Because the house rule was not the rules.
Right, exactly. So what happened instead was that my co-designer Ananda, we're both nerdy, but he's super nerdy. And before Board Game Geek was such a big thing, and there were places where GMT was posting information about its games. He got very into it, and he became a playtester for them.
Okay.
And I was his playtest opponent.
Okay.
So he would bring the games home, and then we would try them out. And some of the things that we started seeing, we were like, this we could do better than. So that's kind of how it started. And then in addition, we were both really drawn to card-driven games. We really liked We the People, Mark Herman's first card-driven design. But all of the games that had come after that kept getting longer and longer. And we're at the age, we're out of college, we're getting jobs, we're getting married, kids soon. So that time that is required, I love Paths of Glory, for instance, but Paths of Glory can be a 12-hour game. Yeah. I don't have 12 hours for a game anymore. No. So I needed more things like We the People. So that was something else that we were designing towards. We're designing towards the amount of time in our lifestyle. Shorter games with meaningful decisions was the idea.
Yeah. And what was your first game? Was that a co-creation between you and, how do you pronounce his name?
Ananda Gupta.
Ananda Gupta. What was your first sort of leap into designing board games as the two of you?
So Twilight Struggle was our first design.
Okay.
And Ananda and I, we initially, since we thought the card-driven mechanic is good for games, war games that have a lot to do with politics. So we were looking for a Civil War context initially. Mm-hmm. So we tried the Spanish Civil War at first. And I started reading about the Spanish Civil War and realized I could probably spend the rest of my life reading about the Spanish Civil War, and I still wouldn't understand the Spanish Civil War. So then Ananda had the great idea of trying the Cold War. Since I'm a little older than Ananda, and if you studied political science in the 80s, everything was the Cold War anyway. So it was very natural. Then the problem became narrowing the game because the cards and the rest of it sort of suggested itself.
And I'm curious of your design process. We can take Twilight Struggle as a specific example of that, but I'm pretty sure that you have been through the same processes in 1989. But how do you get from the idea phase to, let's say, just the plate testing phase, the early, the mid, the late phases? How, I mean, initially you must have thrown up a lot of events, world events, and saying, okay, so all these are cool events and we can play off that. But how do you get into the mechanics from the idea in a political game like this?
So, as you say, with Twilight Struggle, there are a billion events. We started choosing rules to eliminate them. So, for instance, one of the rules is that none of the cards have anything to do with events that didn't affect the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. So for instance, there's a war between Greece and Turkey in the 70s, but because that war does not have a Soviet-U.S. dynamic, it's not a card. So we narrowed events that way. That was the first thing.
You made your own rule to make
internal.
Ideas.
How do we get down to 200 cards with all of this history? In terms of just the mechanics of it, most of my games have worked the same way, and this is why I almost always work with a co-designer, although I might try not once, but so far this has been the right answer for me. It helps me to owe some other person some element of the design, and that's how I meet my timelines and deadlines, because if I know you're producing work, then I feel obligated to produce some work myself. So we're meeting in 2 weeks. I have to get this done. Sure. Otherwise, I will procrastinate the rest of my life, like the other 15 designs in the back of my head that I never get to paper.
Yeah. Were you specifically aware that the Twilight Struggle would be a two-player game, or was there ideas or time in the process where it might have gone to a, like, I don't know if it's fair to say a regular sized board game. It's not that it isn't a regular,
right?
But at the time you were doing this, these two-player things were something we were only seeing. You mentioned GMT before, but it was a very war game confrontation style of setting it up.
So for two of the games that I've done, Twilight Struggle and 1960, Making the President, which is Kennedy versus Nixon presidential election game, also card-driven. Both of them had the genre, or kind of a genre problem. So there were a lot of games about the Cold War, right? But they came in two categories. There were games that hypothesized a war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And so, you know, you moving tanks in the Fulda Gap. Yeah. So it was all of that. Hypothetical World War III. And there were a ton of those. And then there were games about the Cold War, but they tended to be multiplayer games. Mm-hmm. So they would, Games Workshop put out one of these, but there were a bunch of them. The thing about the Cold War is that one of its distinctive characteristics is that it is a binary conflict between two philosophies, two camps, so it lends itself to the idea that it should be a two-player game, we thought. And we were always designing a two-player game for that reason. Similarly, I have no earthly idea why this is true. We had a ton of U.S. presidential election games, but they were almost always two-player game or multiplayer games. Which, and again, the U.S. presidential election is a two-player affair, really.
Either or.
Right? So, so our designs kind of fix a hole in the ludography of the world.
Oh, that's great. I have written down that I want to ask you about designing a game about politics versus a political game. Was it always easy for you to sort of step away from your own views about the influences or the impacts of these different events, or do you have any thoughts? I'm guessing that you must have been in a situation both with the presidential, the making of the president, and in the Twilight Struggle, even though that's more like a historical thing. But is there, or could you share with us your thoughts of the game about politics rather than a political game?
So, yeah, that's an interesting question. And I actually, at this festival, I got a nice compliment from a Polish gamer who said that we played it straight with Twilight Struggle. We don't...
That's a head off
yeah,
for
yeah,
an
yeah.
Eastern Europe country.
Yeah. If you get that compliment from an Eastern European, I guess you can say, we got it close.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. Since I am a Democrat and I work in politics, I have to be in actually political games like Campaign Manager, which is a recent election, and even 1960, which is a more distant election. I have to be very conscious of my bias, my own personal political bias. But maybe an asset for working in politics for most of my adult life is that you get a little bit cynical about both sides, so you can sort of see the failings of your own party and your own politicians.
You're forced to see it from the outside.
Yeah, right. So that's okay, I think. So I try, even though I don't hide my political leanings in any way, shape, or form, so people who know me online tend to know that I've worked for Democrats and whatnot. I have never had anyone who played one of my political games complain to me that it was too biased towards one side or the other. I guess if there's a complaint about Twilight Struggle, it's that it's slightly biased towards the Soviets anyway. So,
so I've heard, yeah.
So, I guess, again, we may have overdone it.
Okay, yeah. Making so sure that the blues wasn't in favor.
Right.
But does people come up to you and say that you have biased it towards the Soviet Union in Twilight Struggle? I mean.
Oh yes. Yeah. Many people, and initially, before people had played the game a lot, I would get all sorts of comments about there's no way the Americans can win. Now, I knew that wasn't true because I always played the Americans, and I had never been beaten. But of course, I knew the game well, and I also knew that the Soviets were easier to play. That was kind of a design decision. It's a little bit asymmetric. The Soviets have an early advantage, but you have to kind of prick away at it slowly but surely. So it took a while for players to understand American strategy and how you had to go about it.
Yeah, okay. And we all know that Twilight Struggle went top 1 on Board Game Geek, and congratulations for that. That's an achievement in itself. But at what point did you guys know that you had made a people's favorite, or basically that you have made a really good game here?
Well, I think the first indication that we had kind of a hit, well, there were 2 indications, I suppose. One was how fast the first set of copies sold, so that was good. But that year that it came out, there's the World Board Game Championships. I mean, world in air quotes, but anyway, you know how we call everything world champions in the United States, no matter what
you're
the World Series.
As a world champion in American football if you win the National Football League.
Precisely.
Yes. Was that a convention or a fair or?
It's a convention. It is unique amongst American conventions in that its orientation is towards competition and tournaments.
Okay.
Everything is a tournament, unlike Gen Con, which is more of a trade fair, a bit more like Essen. Anyway, we went there and we had they had 100 slots and the tournament completely full.
Wow.
On its first year out. So then we're like, this is going to be a thing.
That must have been fantastic to
Yeah.
see, right?
Yeah, it was. It was.
That's amazing. Was it from the beginning designed as something that could be played as tournaments? I mean, in Denmark, I was about to say our part of the world. That's probably not true, but I believe most games in Denmark are played first and foremost for the fun of it, and then there might, once in a while, you hear of some group that have finally gotten around setting something up as a tournament, which is a special thing in itself. But it might be just because we're not 300 million people talking the same language. I don't know. Was it from a design point of view always it needed to have the competition, not only that one player would beat the other, but that there would be I don't know how you say, comparatively scoring or
we took it into consideration, but it wasn't initially a design desire. We weren't designing for tournament play in our head necessarily. But I distinctly remember one of our playtesters, a very competitive and successful war gamer at these tournaments, he told us one of the great things about this game is that the more you know and the more you play, the better you will be, which makes it a good competition game, right? So it's not just luck-driven.
Exactly, yeah, it feeds into its own success in that regard.
And so it does lend itself to tournament play. And once in a while, I will encounter people who will say, "Oh, Twilight Struggle is purely luck," and then I'll be able to say,
"Then you will say, I'm a lawyer." And that's simply not true.
Well, no, I mean, I think there's better proof than that. At the World Board Game Championships, which has a single elimination structure for its tournament, the same person has won 3 years in a row. So
that's lucky.
That's really lucky.
That's a lucky guy. Oh, great. My last question really for you, Jason, is what are you working on at the moment? Is there anything you can or will or are allowed to share with us, or are you just living off the interest of your former successes? Or
from your lips to God's ears, but we'll see. So I have 2 projects underway. There's an old project that's finally coming to fruition. Ananda kind of successfully used Twilight Struggle to further his career. So he went from Twilight Struggle into computer game design.
Okay.
And so that's great for him. The bad thing about it was that computer game design companies tend to be very jealous about intellectual property. So anything that came out of his head initially belonged to them.
Sure.
So we had this project, and it was put on freeze for about 4 or 5 years because he couldn't
touch your finger
without them owning it. So he switched companies recently, and he has a better deal with them, and so now we're good to go again. So that game, it's called Imperial Struggle, and the idea behind it is that we're going to do the rivalry between Britain and France from the War of Spanish Succession in the late 1600s to the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay.
So we'll try kind of a Cold War prequel.
Yeah.
But there's more war in it, obviously.
Yeah. Okay.
And then to the will you ever design a game by yourself problem.
Question.
Queen Games, which has published a lot of stuff, but they have a game called Wallenstein, or it was rethemed as Samurai. They've asked me to do something with that general mechanic, with their dropping meeple down a tower, but they want it themed towards the American Civil War. So, okay.
That's where you come in.
That's where I come in. The hard part was that their initial request, being Euro gamers or Euro design company, was that it needed to be multiplayer. Well, again, the Civil War is a binary problem, right? It's the north or the south.
The successful one is a failure for the other. Yeah.
So I suggested instead that we expand the game to the whole continent, so that you would have the Confederates and the Union, but at the same time that war is occurring, and actually because that war is occurring, France invades Mexico. So it'll be a 4-player kind of...
2 axes, but...
Right.
Yeah.
The 2 wars going on at the same time, there'll be a certain partnership element of it, so the Union will cooperate with the Mexicans and the Confederates with the French, because historically there was some of that, actually. Yeah. And so I'm working on that as well.
It's very interesting. Jason Mathews, thank you so much for lending us half an hour of your Easter, and just want to say thank you and good luck with your future projects.
Thank you so much, and happy Easter.
Thank you. Actually, now the mic is still on. And this might be old news to you, but we have a Danish, I would guess we could call him an upcoming Danish game designer, who took Twilight Struggle, sort of the basic influencing part of Twilight Struggle, and made it into a game called 13 Days, which sort of revolves around the obviously Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. Have you ever seen that game?
Yes. So they're great guys. They were kind enough to send me a copy of the rules and the general game before publication, and I guess they were. I don't know if they were just making me aware. They kind of wanted permission to go forward, something to that effect.
Well, I think it's an obvious inspiration from that game. So, but it's very boiled down and condensed.
Indeed. So I gave it a serious look, and I thought this is a good game. So I actually made introductions to them for them, rather to their American publisher, because I knew he would like to have a game like this in his repertoire. So that all worked out for the better. Now, I had hoped to actually meet them here. I guess they got held up, but and we'd had some conversations about meeting here, but I guess next time I'm in Scandinavia.
Okay. Yeah, because isn't they around? No? Okay. I just thought that I saw Asger a couple of days ago.
Asger isn't here.
No? Okay. But I guess they went on to, I don't know if that's probably a design thing. If you took a game the size of Twilight Struggle and condensed that down to a 1 hour game or 45 minutes game.
Yeah, I think the elevator pitch is Twilight Struggle in 45 minutes.
45 minutes, something like that. But they have even condensed their own condensed version even further to a 13 minutes game. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that, and I really would like to see what they've done in 13 minutes. But I think it's possible. Like if you just focus on the nuclear tension problem, right? There's a game there, like who pushes the button first or how to avoid pushing the button. But I don't know what they've done there, but I'm curious to see.
Yeah, I believe Jason and I was talking about the Trump getting elected in the U.S. and we were arguing that he simply hadn't understood the rules because there had to be several phases before you could press the nuclear button, and apparently he just thinks that it's a binary problem, right? But it might be that he has been playing 13 minutes, perhaps, and there's only press the button, yes or no.
Yes or no.
So
that's the next game, 13 seconds.
13 seconds.
Will you press the button or no? Go.
Actually, if the ballistic missile takes 13 seconds, it'll probably take more than that. But it could be a good pitch. Jason, again, thank you so much for being here.
Guys. My pleasure.
Det var det. Det var alt, hvad vi nåede at snakke med Jason Mathews om. Vi håber, I kunne lide det. Find links til spillene på www.papskubber.dk/podcast, hvor du også finder links til tidligere episoder. Det her det er rent faktisk episode nummer 40, så der er noget at tage fat på, hvis du ikke har hørt dem alle sammen. Send forslag til fremtidige episoder, til emner eller indspark. Kommentarer til den her episode kan også lægges på Facebook. Og du kan maile til os på papstinenser@papskubber.dk. Lad os høre, hvor Twilight Struggle ligger henne på din liste. Og lad os allerede nu varsle, at næste episode også kommer til at berøre Twilight Struggle en hel del. Det var alt for denne gang. I studiet var rent faktisk kun Bo Jørgensen og Jason Mathews.